Excellencies, distinguished delegates, esteemed participants, whether you're joining us online today or you're here in the room with us at the United Nations headquarters in New York, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2024 edition of UNIDIR's Cyber Stability Conference. It's the second year in a row that we're gathering here in New York, and really it's no coincidence that this is happening just a few days before the start of the open-ended working group for its 7th session this coming Monday. Of course, we want this conference to be as impactful as possible, and it's UNIDIR's aim with this conference to provide useful, actionable knowledge that member states and all stakeholders part of multilateral discussions on international cybersecurity can immediately then leverage. Now, the theme we've chosen for this year is cyber threats. That's perhaps an obvious choice. It's also not the first time that the topic is being addressed, but we nonetheless felt it's an urgent topic and a very much ongoing topic. States are increasingly concerned, of course, about the evolution of the threat landscape in cyberspace, a domain that is becoming certainly more complex and with that potentially more difficult to navigate. New technologies in particular, artificial intelligence and quantum computing, can be used to create entirely new threats, or they can be used to significantly maximize existing challenges and threats by increasing their accuracy, their sophistication, the frequency, the scale and effect, and by making them harder to detect or to counter. In addition, the digitalization of control systems and critical infrastructure and the reliance on ICTs for the provision of critical services to the public and our societies, combined with the growing complexity of digital supply chains, all these increase the global attack surface, and with this, the risk for malicious cyber activity is also expanded manifold. And finally, the cyber domain in 2024 is, of course, characterized by a multitude of different actors, including, but also clearly not limited to states, and all of them play a critical role in shaping the threat landscape. It's against this background, really, that it's not surprising that the issue of threats has gained significant interest again and significant momentum also in multilateral discussions related to ICTs and international peace and security. In 2023 alone, in the context of the open-ended working group, I think there were more than 100 interventions by states and the multi-stakeholder community focusing just on the topic of threats. So to help us navigate this ever-evolving threat landscape, UNIDIR has gathered a wide and really diverse variety of experts from all sectors and all geographies. Over the next 2 days at this conference, almost 30 experts will take part in our panels, exploring in depth both the nature of different types of threats and then also, of course, their relationship to the framework of responsible state behavior. Now, before we dive in and get started here today, I really would like to sincerely thank all the sponsors to this conference. UNIDIR, as many of you will know, is a voluntary funded organization, and that means that our work, and this includes this conference, would not be possible, and I mean it, simply not be possible without the generous support of our donors. The 2024 edition of UNIDIR's Cyber Stability Conference, organized by UNIDIR's Security and Technology program, is supported by the governments of France, of Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland, and by Microsoft, and we're very grateful for your support. Now, I would now like to introduce and then give the floor to Dr. Giacomo Persi Paoli, who is the head of UNIDIR's Security and Technology Program. He will be the master of ceremony for the next day and a half at this conference. And I wish you all fruitful, engaging, and hopefully productive discussions. Thank you all, and over to you, Giacomo, please.
Thank you, Robin, for the introduction, and please allow me also to extend my deep gratitude to all of you for joining us here in person in New York or online. It is really a pleasure for me to be the master of ceremony over the next 2 days, and this is I swear to you, this is going to be the longest that you're going to hear me speak, between now and the end of the conference. But I was also given the opportunity to provide you all with a sort of like a scene setting briefing. The topic is very complex. And we thought that in order for us to help contextualize this conference a little bit better, it would be important to have some sort of scene setting segment. So there was so much ground to cover that it was really difficult for me to determine where to start in setting the scene for this conference. I wanted to find interesting statistics and graphics and visuals to share with you information on successful attacks, costs, level of harm, but you only need to Google it to be very easily overwhelmed by how much information there is out there for those that are interested in knowing how bad things are going in the cyber world today. However, I then came across a statistic that to me is the most important of all, and that leaves me completely astonished every time that I read it. And it is the statistics that says that 99% of cyber attacks would be ineffective if people and organizations were implementing basic cybersecurity measures. Now, depending who you ask, this statistic can fluctuate between 99.2, 98, but the long story, very short, is that the vast majority of cyber attacks could be mitigated by implementing basic cybersecurity measures. Now, what we consider to be basic may have evolved over time as threats have become more sophisticated, but what I really want to take out of this statistic are two key observations. First, that we're still today the main determinants of our digital safety and security. And therefore, it is important that both people and individuals, but also states, both at the individual and collectively, continue to raise the bar for malicious cyber actors and invest in building their respective cyber resilience. The second observation is that while very small, 1% is not zero. And that means that it is important that the discussions around mitigating threats also touch on measures that go beyond basic cyber hygiene. So in this context, I found particularly useful a famous observation made by a futurologist, Roy Amara, and that observation came to mind because people tend to overestimate the short-term impact of new technologies while underestimating their long-term effects. And the reason why I think this is a good place to continue our conversation is not only because our first panel today will focus on the impact of artificial intelligence on cyber, but also because more in general, I believe that this observation is an important reminder of how fluid and constantly evolving the ecosystem within which digital technologies are deployed truly is. As such, it is very important to maintain a somewhat balanced approach between the impact that we can see today and foresee in the short term, call it 1 or 2 years, and the longer-term impact considerations that may explore more systemic and transformative effects. Now, talking about the evolution of cyber threats, it is no exception to this consideration. Cyber threats are undoubtedly evolving, but to ensure that we are prepared to face this evolution, we should keep considering both how this is impacting national, regional, and international security today, but also be proactive in thinking beyond the here and the now, and try to anticipate to the best of our abilities longer-term impacts. As just mentioned by Robin in his opening remarks, this conference focuses on 3 key elements of what we generally refer to as threats. We're going to be talking about technology, we're going to be talking about types of attacks, and about threat actors. So the how, the what, and the who, if you want. And while this breakdown was a necessary measure to give the conference a working structure, it is clear how these elements do not really exist in isolation from each other, but rather are interconnected and mutually reinforcing. So how can we foresee the threat evolving in the short and long term? I think that to answer this question, we really need to start by looking at the different types of actors. So let's say that there are, roughly speaking, 3 broad categories of actors that we can look at. The first is the very highly capable and highly resourceful actors. And this category really includes a very small selection of states that have both the means and the resources and the skills and the capabilities. The second category includes the capable and the moderately, if you want, resourceful actors. And within this category, we find most of the other states, some commercial companies, and organized criminal groups. And the third and final category includes the individual hackers for hire, the activists, the small criminal actors. These can be less capable, although sometimes, they're not. But even when skills are matched, actors in this category simply do not have access to the same level of resources of the other two. So in this context, if we take the example of artificial intelligence, what impact could AI have on cyber capabilities? Well, in the short term, it is most likely that AI is going to benefit actors in the third category because it is intended to lower barrier to entry to effective and scalable malicious cyber operations, increasing both the volume of successful compromise devices and accounts. But actors in the second category may find it useful and the most benefit in boosting their capabilities, for example, to conduct reconnaissance or more complex types of social engineering. But if we give it enough time, and here we go back to the time component, the actors in the first category, those that are both highly capable and highly resourceful, will be best placed to harness AI's potential in advanced cyber operations against networks, for example, by using it to generate new type of malicious code, new type of malware, etc. This is not something that can be done without sufficient resources and skills. This is just an example, but it's just useful to contextualize the discussion. And this leads me to the second and final part of this short scene setter. What can we do about it? So the answer to this question is probably as long as a PhD thesis, but if we focus on one element in particular, given that this conference is taking place just a couple of days before the open-ended group resumes its work. So almost a decade ago, states agreed on a framework and of a set of norms of responsible state behavior, which along with international law, confidence-building measures, and capacity building, form the framework of responsible state behavior. So this conference is really not only interested in explaining what the threats are, but also aims at exploring how such threats can undermine or challenge the implementation of the framework, as well as how, on the other hand, and this is a very important part, the framework can be leveraged to increase individual and collective resilience of states to an increasingly complex threat landscape. It is an ambitious goal, we know that, but we're lucky to have gathered an exceptional set of speakers to help us achieving it. And this is the perfect place for me to wrap this up. And before I introduce you to our first panel, explain to all of you, whether you're here in the room or online, how you can engage with us throughout the conference. We will be collecting your questions and observations to a virtual platform called Slido. If you're here in the room, you have a flyer on your desk that has a QR code that you can scan with your phone, and you can just, once the page opens, you can simply put the hashtag CS2024 and ask your questions. These questions will be visible to the moderator, and he or she will be very happy to pass them on to the speakers. Please do engage. Do not wait until the end of the panels. These panels are really structured as conversations, so there's not going to be a formal moment when presentations are over and it's time to open the floor for questions. It's going to be a very dynamic exchange between experts, so please do submit your questions as they come to mind. And with that, I think it's now time for us to introduce the first panel, and we'll invite to join me here on stage. It's my colleague Charles Oving, Political Affairs Officer with the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, that will be the moderator of the first panel. And also our speakers, some of which are joining us online and some are here in the room. So if Lauren Stockton, Consulting Senior Analyst for Accenture, is here in the room, if she can please, here she is, join us here on stage. We will leave you the central seats and have a great panel. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much for that introduction. I just want to take a second to thank our panelists. So we have Lauren, who's with me, consulting senior analyst at Accenture. We're also joined remotely by Kaleem Usmani, head of the Computer Emergency Response Team in the Republic of Mauritius, and Shimona Mohan, associate researcher on the Gender, Security, and Technology files at UNIDIR. So there are full details of those bios available on the conference program, which is available on the event webpage if anyone wants to look in detail. Our panel today will be examining the impact that technology is having in shaping the ICT threat landscape, with a particular focus on AI. While it is often mentioned that AI will significantly impact cyber threats in terms of speed, scale, complexity, we want to understand what this actually means in practical terms. So, why and how will AI achieve such transformative effect? Who and what sector is most likely to benefit from such transformations? And who or what sector is most likely to be negatively impacted? So if it's okay with the panel, I will start by speaking to everyone with first names, if that's all right, and we can get straight into it. My background is AI and responsible AI, which is why I'm being involved here. And I want to start on the question of AI impact on cyber threats. So Lauren, I know you've been looking at AI's impact on increasing accessibility for the tools behind cyber threats. So you want to ask what kind of developments are happening now, who is likely to be the most negatively impacted, and what kind of negative impacts can we expect? I'm going to be turning to each panel member in turn. We'll each have about 5 minutes because we want to make sure we have enough time for the Q&A, and a reminder of Giacomo's point about the questions can come through Slido. So with no further ado, Lauren, over to you.
Thank you. Honored to be here. Oh. Thank you. Honored to be here. Great to be here. Looking at this question, so the developments that are happening within AI, looking at how they're increasing those tools behind cyber threats. Honestly, the most basic way to say it is that they're allowing cyber criminals to do the same things, but faster and better, and at a larger scale, that's the most basic way to say it. But going into what they're actually doing, what are they helping us do faster, looking at the automation of attacks, so not having to individually deploy attacks anymore, and also looking at that reconnaissance, phishing, malware, deployment, these things that they're the same threat actors, and they're the same threats that have always been. They are just increased in scale and complexity, and we're having to counter more and more of them as AI gets better and better. And then a very large point is creating those believable phishing messages, creating that because AI can tailor those large, can tailor attacks by analyzing those large amounts of data, it increases the effectiveness and makes it harder to attack. And that can also overwhelm those traditional security defenses. Now, so those are some of the attacks that AI can increase. Now, looking on what was said before as well, looking at the cybercrime accessibility, that emergence of AI, this is general AI because it is general now, it was more specific before, but it lowers all the barriers to entry for cyber criminals. And this is contained also with the lack of enforceable cybercrime laws. And both of these things, in addition to a bunch of other stuff, are coming together to increase the number and complexity of threats. Because cybercrime is often an international crime, and it brings with it both the already present geopolitical tensions and also the diplomatic complications into this very new area of international law. And so we have the law side, but on the global economic side, we also have challenges such as rising inflation, income inequality that exacerbate this issue more. in addition to the decline of real wages, climate challenges. All of these things create circumstances where cybercrime at that lower level, at that third group, is incentivized. This outcome is and continues to be that more individuals may turn to cybercrime, and this isn't solely due to a state influence or to like moral motivations, but because it offers that lower risk opportunity and a higher financial reward when they're put in those in situations where that is the best option. And looking at who is going to be the most negatively impacted, it's not really a surprise that it will likely be small and medium enterprises. They have a limited resources for cybersecurity defense, and they also lack expertise in the technology necessary to defend from those attacks, and especially from those enhanced AI attacks. Many of them don't have the capabilities to defend against normal attacks, and they're still building up that foundational cyber resilience, which is extremely important. Specific sectors, looking at specific sectors, again, finance, healthcare, critical infrastructure, the sectors that handle sensitive data and provide essential services. Usually where those things intersect is going to be the areas that are most vulnerable and most likely to be attacked more. Moving to like more private organizations in general, those who implement this emerging technology, not just AI, but do this without ensuring their foundational cyber resilience is in place. So I think of it as like you throw a blanket over a mess. The mess is still there, but now it just looks a little bit better, but doesn't mean things can't get to the mess. And then also externally, organizations who don't understand their supply chain. This can be, this area is, this vulnerability has continuously been exploited and will continue to be exploited as we go forward. And then a very large part, and I think a large part of that will be part of this conference, is looking at how governments are dealing with disinformation and misinformation campaigns. Because AI, when we're talking about scale and complexity, we can also talk about the amount of misinformation and disinformation that can be put out, the rate. And this is a critical area not only in general, but because we have a very large amount of elections coming up in the next few years. So that is the general overall negatively, but there's also positives.
No, thank you very much. That's fantastic. That's a very, very nice summary, which is a very difficult thing to do in this space. You've touched on issues there like automation, scale, effectiveness, lowered barriers to entry, challenges around enforceable cyber law, negative impact on SMEs primarily as a capacity problem, I think, and critical infrastructure. I really liked the mess example, the simile with the blanket, and issues around misinformation. I think everyone knows how many elections we're expecting this year alone. So with that, I'm going to pass on to the other panel members for their thoughts, but I also, if we have time, want to come back and offer if you want to say anything else. So I think if we turn first to Kaleem, if you have any thoughts in this area or any reactions you want to make.
Thank you, Charles. Can you hear me, Charles? Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
sounds
you
good.
very much. And first of all, I'd like to thank UNIDIR for giving me a floor and opportunity to talk into this conference. And surely I come from the CSOC background, and very much what we do and we talk about is and deal with these cyber threats, and especially have been involved into the UNGGE process as well as the UNOWG process, which is already my team and myself, we are the part of it, and then we are looking at the different aspects of that particular process. And I think this specific topic of how the AI's impact on cyber threats, I think a lot of things already Lauren has talked about it, because what we are seeing right now is the cyber threat landscape is changing, and is changing exponentially because attack surface is increasing. And this is where into the whole process of OWG, we are talking about the emerging threats, and especially we talk about the ransomwares, we talk about the social media threats, we are talking about the artificial intelligence-based threat. This is where I think we have to focus on. We are talking about the quantum computing. And then especially, again, we are talking about on the CII's critical information infrastructure-based threats. So basically, the first question I think which Charles wanted to understand from us is that what kind of developments are happening now, and if the way we see threats and the way these threat actors, they are using AI as a technology in order to in a way develop those threats around. Then what we see here is the creation of a new malware, because creation of a new malware is something could be done with scale and with complexity once we're using the AI technology, and that's something alarming, and that's what we need to see, and that's what we need to how that could be prevented. And also something, the development which we are seeing here is the AI's ability to prompt attacks quickly, because the way these attacks could be launched is much faster, and I think Lauren mentioned that, and that's again something, the trend which we are seeing not only in Mauritius or the world. The same trend is in a way very much present around. Even if I look at the region where I come from, a similar kind of trend is going on, because we are seeing that this particular technology is being used in order to scale up the different types of threats. And because why the reason is that this kind of technology, and especially if we talk about the Google Bard and the chatbot, these chatbots, if we talk about, they have the capacity in order to in a way develop codes and write codes much faster, and then obviously these codes are changed into the form of a malware, and then they are used for different types of attacks. And also broadcasting security vulnerabilities, normally the attackers which they're using. So this is, again, could be expedited using especially the AI. So that's also some sort of a trend which is going on. And also it has the ability to automate increasingly sophisticated attack, which will increase threat volumes exponentially. And this is the reason. And once the volume is increasing exponentially, then it really becomes difficult in order to manage threats at the level of any ICT infrastructure or critical infrastructure. And that's what we see. And this is where the scope of the whole next generation SOC we talked about, and then maybe that I'll mention a little bit later, that how it's going to be. So the point here is that this is the trend, what we see, and obviously the AI is in a way facilitating the whole fabrication of different types of complex attacks, which is difficult to manage. This is I think one part of it. And who is likely to be most negatively impacted? Because I think rightly it has been said that if we have to have a basic controls in place, then we'll be able to save a larger amount of attacks or compromises which we can have. So, but basically, again, I think Lauren mentioned about the SMEs, and SMEs, they are the most vulnerable sectors. I do agree again with that, because the reason is that these people, and all across the governments, including in my country, the kind of infrastructure which SMEs they have, that infrastructure obviously is not that resilient as compared to the bigger organizations, those who have much more funding in order to put up their IT or ICT infrastructure much better. So that's again one of the areas which will be or which is negatively impacted, and then also because because we are, for example, if we look at which are the industries which are most affected with the different interests where these actors they have, and because a financial industry is one, and I think we can't deny the fact, because wherever there is a money or wherever there is a data which makes money, obviously this is the industry which is most attacked, and if we look into that component, then financial industry is one, and then of course healthcare is again a lucrative industry, which I think Lauren again mentioned, and again I'm mentioning that this is another where we are talking about the healthcare services, and if we look at the past examples, most of healthcare of different countries, they have been attacked, and then again it continues because health data is a data which is an expensive data that could be sold into the black market, and obviously there is gain out of it. Now also some sort of, again, attacks on hospitals, clinics, medical devices, because again, these are something critical for if you talk about, in a way, our telemedicine, and if these devices are used for surgery, and if they are compromised, obviously we can understand the impact what it can have onto the patient. So that's something, again, is the component. The government industry, of course, I mean, that is again is the tag, because especially the non-state actors, they're very much, have the interest in order to find out with certain interest onto the government data. That's again something what we have been seeing, and especially also the CIIs, because critical information infrastructure is a key infrastructure, and then if they, and I think Ukraine is one very good example where we have been seeing that critical infrastructures have been attacked. But again, the positive side of AI was there, which I think we'll be talking into the next question, where we'll be coming back to that, how defensive mechanisms which we can have in place, which allows us in order to be able to defend that. So these are some of the industry which are largely impacted with this AI technology, and then the using AI technology for launching different types of attacks. And then negative impacts, obviously, I think Lauren talked about in this negative impacts. This is leading towards, because a loss to data, and lots of money is being lost because of this particular the technology adopted by these particular actors, and then coming back to how this could be really connected into the OEDWG process consultation, which is happening next week. Then obviously we can see that how these norms implementation could happen, how we can have these confidence building measures that could be put up in place from region to region, and then the region they could interact together in order to have that network which allows us to be better protected and prevent threats collectively. And this is where the information sharing or cyber threat intel information sharing comes into picture. So maybe
thank you very much, Kaleem. Actually, just on that point, I think this is a good point to segue to Shimona. So I do want to first thank you very much for a really good summary of some of the trends in this space, and especially to highlight the dangerous word exponential, which comes up in this space a lot and is particularly worrying with relation to AI, and to underline these points around capacity in particular. So Lauren mentioned SMEs, and you mentioned state capacity and so on. So Shimona, I want to turn to you and then give Lauren just a second as well before we move on to the beneficial areas, which I think will build quite well on what you're talking about at the moment, Kaleem. I'll also just mention to the panelists as well, if we can focus particularly on the what questions rather than the who questions when we're talking about states. So Shimona, I'm going to hand over to you for 5 minutes and then hand back to Lauren.
Right. Thank you, Charlie. And thank you to both Lauren and Kaleem for excellent points raised already. I think I'll just pick up on a couple of threads that I've seen here, which might be particularly interesting in terms of what you just said, Charlie, about focusing on the what here. So one of the things that I really found interesting amongst everything that Lauren said was about how there's an increase in this sort of idea of scam bots, that cyber threats have just become a lot more accessible because AI has been applied to them, and you can see them in examples as simple as something like scam bots, which come to you directly through your emails. So that's a very granular sort of example of how we're seeing AI affect cyber threats. And on this point of sort of AI making cyber warfare more accessible due to a lower threshold of entry, that also points towards really interesting sort of paradigm of how there are some states which are a lot more ahead in their AI readiness than a lot of other states, which then sort of heads to this this disbalance in terms of attack and defense posturing when it comes to cyber threats as well. And I think a lot of this is due to how states also prioritize their AI development. So when we're speaking of the what, in a lot of scenarios, there are states which are sort of focusing a lot more on tech for development. We heard about critical infrastructure, we heard about healthcare, education, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the priority for a lot of states at this point is to make sure that the tech that's being developed indigenously, especially in their country, is to make sure that their critical infrastructure is really benefiting from the cascade effects of that. But then while doing so, it's also important to sort of keep in mind that there's an aspect of cyber resilience to all of this. Now, we speak a lot about cybersecurity. And I think, especially with AI, we're sort of heading a lot more faster into the entire conversation around cyber resilience, which is a larger concept of making sure that your systems are, so to speak, cyber resilient at all times, that they are resilient to being attacked, that they are not just in a defensive posturing, they're also in a readiness posturing, given the kind of threats that AI has now brought into the cyber domain. And I think this cyber resilience aspect is very interesting, especially now that we're seeing a lot more services go online as well. For example, payments, digital payments are now becoming the new big thing in terms of fintech. And that, of course, there are a lot of other areas wherein cyber threats are also very, very critical. But for fintech especially, I mean, it's the entire backbone of a country. So it's very interesting to see how these kind of conversations are tending towards a developmental aspect as well as a security aspect. And as Charlie said, I mean, there are the threats around AI and cyber are non-exhaustive. They are existing, they are exacerbating, they are evolving, and they are emerging. And there is no end to how many threats we can observe here. But one of the other things that I really wanted to highlight, especially after Kaleem's points of cybersecurity as well, are how we sort of have to also keep in mind that there's sort of a parity in terms of the cyber AI haves and have-nots, because in the end, we've seen this with like other conventional weapon systems or weapons of mass destructions, etc. That there are treaties or there are political processes around these particular systems, and then that creates sort of a level of haves and have-nots, which disgruntled states, especially the have-nots, are not really keen on exploring. So the idea here is when we're discussing cyber and AI, something that all countries at some point in some capacity are exploring, there should also sort of be some sort of discussions around parity of making sure that these states are all included into the conversation. And while we're speaking of states, I would also like to make sure that when we speak of states, we're also dividing that sectorally. So we're talking about states in terms of both their civilian as well as military aspects of cyber and AI, and that we're also speaking of both tech as well as governance audiences, because siloing of any of these is going to be very, very detrimental for how we're seeing the future of tech going in either of these spaces. And I think I'll rest my points here for now, but I look forward to the next questions.
That's fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Shimona. And I think it's a really important point you pick up on there as well. And we have this thread going on throughout about capacity, and especially around AI readiness, cyber resilience, and so on. But particularly that point about a distinction between civil and military. And especially in this kind of case when we're talking about both outreach and development of that capacity, so whether it's, weakness in SMEs or states that have limited capacity, but making sure that any outreach is reaching those different audiences. So before we move on to the next area, I just want to check, Lauren, if there's anything you want to add on this subject, or we'll go straight on to the beneficial areas.
I think we covered everything.
Fantastic. Okay, I want to move to this area and go straight to Kaleem first, because I think this picks up on some of the points you were making in your intervention before. So we're now looking at the beneficial aspects of AI as a technology for this threat space. So Kaleem, you have been dealing with both how AI tools are helping to make threat detection and related tasks more effective, as well as how certain AI policies can help countries to better manage the cyber threats they face. We've been getting some questions on the slide around this already. In the short and near term, what are we looking at? So what technical benefits can AI provide, and what AI policies will be beneficial, and who is likely to benefit? So Kaleem, I'll turn to you first and then to the other panelists.
Thank you, Charles. I think a little bit, Charles, before I come back to the answer, I wanted to portray a little bit the picture of the region where I come from, because if we talk about artificial intelligence, and especially artificial intelligence in Africa, and national strategies and initiatives. So something important for us to understand. Based on to that, obviously, we can put on the statement that how the whole policy of AI could be helpful in order for using AI as a technology for the development and economic development of the country. And then surely looking at the AI pose risk and its mitigation that has to be put up into any particular policy of any particular country. And this is again the focus where I will try to put on some sort of a discussion again, and that how and why it is important. And again, I'll be talking about a little bit about the EU AI Act as well, because that's the very comprehensive regulation which has been in a way enacted by EU onto the whole usage of AI technology in Europe particularly. So if quickly, if I talk about Africa, and Africa and the AI strategies in Africa. So surely, if you look at Africa from the other regions, so Africa is lagging behind. But again, AI Africa is making its steps right towards a faster uptake of AI technology, and AI investments and innovation are advancing into the continent. So that's something I'm talking based on to the Diplo research which has been done by Diplo Foundation. That was an interesting document which I found, and then I said I will be able to relate this once I'm talking about the policies around AI, and then what it will entail and how it will be able to help to prevent the AI risk. But obviously, Africa has been slow into the whole uptake of the artificial intelligence technologies for a variety of reasons. And those reasons were basically the infrastructure challenges as well as the limited financial resources. And obviously, that was the reason, okay? And if I look at the global AI index, African countries are placed among wake up and nascent nations, because wake up and nascent nations is kind of a category in order to determine that what is the level of the country for that country to be developing AI technology and then using and adopting AI technology into their country for the different sort of sectors in order to boost that sector development, okay? So based on that, what basically the report talks about that Egypt, Nigeria, and Kenya are into the nascent category, while Morocco, South Africa, and Tunisia are into the waking up category, right? And then there are expectations that AI can be a significant contributor to the region's digital transformation and economic growth. And here is a kind of some statistics which is very interesting for us to note it down and understand that AI industry is growing across Africa with over 2,400 companies specializing in AI. So this report was released somewhere in mid 2023. So it's still, and this has a kind of a weight which we can talk about around that. And then 41% of which are startups, and estimate indicate that technology could contribute around US dollar 1.5 billion to the continent's GDP by 2030. So again, that's something alarming, because unless and until, because why I'm saying this, that the whole AI risk is very much based onto the adoption of technology into the country. If there is less adoption, then obviously the AI risk will be lesser. So that's what we need to understand, that how this is evolving and how it will evolve country to country and then region to region, because the kind of a cyber threat landscape based on AI technology, what Europe will have may not be Africa will have it, because it all depends onto the adoption of that data technology, right? And coming back to some sort of another understanding, the countries, those who have the AI strategy or policy, I should say, are just 3 in Africa out of 55 countries, and that's really something to think about it, and then lots of work around in order to have those countries, other countries to adopt it. Mauritius, Egypt, and Kenya, these are only 3 countries in Africa, those who have the AI policies in place, right? And Mauritius AI strategy was the first one to be developed in 2018. And normally the sectors which it in a way covers and focuses on is manufacturing, healthcare, fintech, agriculture, then it is a smart ports and maritime traffic management. So these are the sectors, and especially another strategy is the Ethiopia, Ghana, Morocco, Rwanda, and South Africa, Tunisia, and Uganda are also taking towards defining AI policy. So that's something again coming up. Now with this particular statistics, and then if we have to talk about is that how AI policies are beneficial, then obviously that's the point for us to make and relate that how this could happen. So AI policies, as we know, will help establish enforceable standards that will be used to manage AI risk, and like any other policy, because and now if we look at the AI policies around the world, many AI policies, they are there by many other countries in other regions. But normally what has been noticed into these AI policies, they talk very little about that how AI risk onto the ICT technologies or emerging technologies that could be addressed. And especially if I talk about Mauritius strategy doesn't talk about, it's quite very much silent that how AI risk could be dealt with, and what actions we will be able to take to deal with the AI. So I think this is something what has to be catered for. But obviously, if you have that particular strategy, it is helpful in order to mitigate that AI risk and control that risk in particular. So in that
I'm just going to
Mauritius,
intervene there for a second, Kaleem, because I think that's a really interesting point on national policy and the need to have policies in order to be able to take advantage and to make beneficial use of the technology, and also the point you made about the need for resources in which to do that. So just being mindful of time, I'm going to turn to Lauren and Shimona first for their thoughts on this, and then if we still have time in this section, I'd love to come back and pick up on this. So I think, Lauren, to you first.
Yeah. Thank you. We talked a bit about infrastructure and the policies that are needed to take advantage of this technology, and how that's different in different regions of the world. Going into the policies and how to get there and how to get that collaboration not only between or like within different areas of the world, but around the world. We do very much need that collaboration, I think, with the public and private sectors, with academia and experts, and that's really the key to gain those benefits of AI that Kaleem was discussing. So we need that collaboration in order to combat the volume and pace that AI enables that ICT threat landscape, and that isn't limited to a certain area or a certain geography. And these attackers, they have agility and they have time. They don't have the regulation, they don't have the policies that we need to put in place, that have been put in place in order to have these ethical standards for this emerging technology. But we have that innovation and that knowledge exchange that we can push through and help promote the responsible development and deployment of AI. And I think part of that policy that really should be widespread is encouraging the AI like R&D investment and also talent development initiatives. I think we already have an issue in that we don't have a large enough cybersecurity workforce globally. And with the advent of AI, it will certainly help to close those gaps, as we've discussed. But the training and education on these new technologies, and not just AI, are going to be imperative to ensure that the talent that we're training now and the talent that we have now has the skills needed to combat the threats now. But we know this is the worst it will ever be.
Thank you very, very much. I think that's a very positive note to transfer to Shimona on. So Shimona, on the policies that would be beneficial and who would benefit?
Definitely. I think there were a lot of already very interesting points raised by Kaleem and Lawrence. So to avoid sort of repeating them, I'll take this in the direction of a little bit more towards the security side of cybersecurity. And just highlight a couple of applications that I'm seeing emerging a lot, which are beneficial in terms of how AI is being applied to cybersecurity. We're seeing a lot more when we speak about military AI or AI for security. There's a tendency to think it's mostly battlefield AI, but then there's so much of the tech side of warfare that happens in your headquarters, behind the front lines, and not really like on them. And I think that's where the cyber and AI mix comes out really, really clearly. Because you have things like decision support tools, you have rapid threat assessments, you have algorithmic decisions, etc., taking place in those wargaming rooms, etc., as well, and that gives you sort of a broad-based perception of how cyber and AI are mixing within this particular field. So when we spoke about policies, when Lauren and Kaleem brought out the policies that are required, I think sort of keeping in mind how these are also applied to the military space might be of help as well. Because at the end of the day, everything that's cybersecurity related also has a very, very big military aspect to it. So another thing that I'm seeing a lot on the horizon are discussions around generative AI and how that is going to affect cybersecurity, especially within its beneficial points. We're seeing a lot more simulated data and AR and VR based, which is AR and VR based wargaming, which are now coming out as well as a result of how generative AI is being applied to the cyberspace. So in a sense, we're just reiterating the conversations around how AI is going to be a force multiplier, but we're seeing them come out more clearly in the cyberspace. And we are also seeing a lot more C6 ISR systems, which would be command control communications, but then the added two Cs on computer and cyber defense and combat systems, along with intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So a massive chunk of currently applied AI in this particular cybersecurity space is in this less exciting, but nevertheless very crucial administrative and back-end logistics systems, such as campaigning planning and analysis and electronic order of battles, and also employing AI on reconnaissance data, etc. So as we discuss this a little bit more, there will be a lot more clearer focuses developing around what is happening and who is affected most, and to whom this might be of a negative sort of connotation as well.
Thank you very, very much, Mona. And coming from the responsible AI and the military side, I think that's a really important point about the tendency to focus on exciting uses of AI as opposed to things that are either more logistical, or especially to look at areas where you have a currently much larger space that includes the overlap with civilian uses. So we have a couple more minutes before we have to move on to the next area. So I want to give Kaleem the opportunity to continue with some of the beneficial points you were making. So you have 2 more minutes, and then we'll move on to the third topic area.
Thank you, Charles. I think I can touch a little bit upon the technical benefits that AI already she has been talking about, but I think maybe I'll be talking very much from the perspective of the CSIRT operations. And normally, if you look at the CSIRT operations, they're very much towards protecting threats and, of course, dealing with the incidents. And what we notice, and that's how we are doing is, if we are talking about incident handling, and especially I'm talking about the SOC environment, and that's the Security Operations Center. So we are running a government SOC, and in the government SOC, what normally we are doing is that we are watching and monitoring the whole traffic of the government, in malicious traffic I'm talking about. So if we talk about that, how AI tools, and we are using those AI tools, and especially if we have to go for a threat identification and threat detection, and even threat analysis, and threat monitoring and threat response. And these are the areas which are the core areas where in each and every organization, whether it's a CSIRT setup or if it's a critical infrastructure, if it's any other infrastructure, that's normally what we need to monitor. And once we have to monitor, and especially if I talk about the technology like the SOC technology like CM. So we are having the AI-based CMs, and then we are having the AI-based source solutions. We are having the AI-based EDR solutions. We are having the full AI SOC concept, which could be deployed. And then what it happens is that it works like a defensive mechanism in order for us to find out the threats and analyze threats much more effectively, and then accordingly take the respond to it, or let's take the mitigation actions accordingly. So these are some of the advantages we see, and also in terms of the network security, for example, if you talk about the endpoint protection, so there are different technologies from the different vendors like Sophos, Darktrace, CrowdStrike, Symantec, Endpoint Cloud, Vitra AI. All these are different technologies which are used into our SOC, and then we see that they are really intelligent, because, and then also what we are doing is that we are using the cyber threat intel platforms, and these cyber threat intel platforms normally they are feeding to the whole SOC, and again they are based onto the whole AI technology, which allows us to do a better analysis, and then accordingly throw alerts and then advisories accordingly. So maybe these are the benefits which we could harness from the AI-based tools, and then obviously including the generative AI we are talking about it. So these are tools much more powerful, and once these are powerful tools, obviously it very much helps into the whole monitoring aspect of any threat which we are talking about. And even this could be extended to the national level threats. For example, if we have to monitor the internet backbone traffic normally, that it becomes a lot easier, because these tools, they allow you to do that much more easily, because you could see much more as compared to the traditional tools which we have been using in the past, for right from the firewalls to the IPS and the IDS, and then other network defense tools, in fact, in particular. So maybe
thank you very much, Kaleem. I actually just want to continue on to the third topic area here, because you're starting to get into it already. So with this one, we wanted to turn to Shimona first, which is looking at vulnerabilities and bottlenecks presented by AI in this threat area. So this is an area that's very close to my work area, so I'm particularly interested. So Shimona, when we're talking about new vulnerabilities and bottlenecks, what are we talking about? And this is, whether we're talking about data issues, adversarial attacks, generative AI, or if you even want to get into resources or anything like that, or something completely different. And at the same time, who is being disproportionately affected by this? And what other inequities or other dynamics are being introduced? This is something we've only touched on lightly so far, but I'd be really curious for the whole panel's thoughts. So Shimona, to you first.
Thank you, Charles. And I think we converge on the fact that this is of special interest to us. So just to start off with where Kaleem sort of left off, we're seeing a lot of data-related issues already emerging as a part of AI, but now also how it intersects with the cyber field as well. And one of the ways which it does is through, for example, adversarial machine learning or data poisoning attacks, which we're seeing a lot more in conversations around AI-related and cybersecurity-related military conversations. So adversarial machine learning, just to give a quick backgrounder, is introducing like corrupt, inaccurate, contaminated, or damaging data to a system in a bid to make it sort of malfunction in a way which is beneficial to you and harmful for your adversary. So we're saying this a lot more, especially where simulated data is employed for military purposes, which is a majority of military actions, because simulated data just provides a lot more flexibility and leeway in terms of how the military AI systems may be trained. So this is of a special interest in terms of cybersecurity as well. And these are very real threats because they can initially render these backbone systems that you have useless or worse, hostile to the host entity. Another sort of area that we're seeing emerging a lot when we speak of generative AI is generative AI and deepfakes. And this is going to be a cause for concern in military applications in the future as well when we speak about cybersecurity. And in fact, UNIDIR had already been discussing these threats before generative AI as we know it came into being. So the topic of our 2021 Innovations Dialogue was centered around security threats that deepfakes bring about, for example. And there's a plethora of research now which sort of details how deepfakes constitute an international security threat apart from solely individual personal threats. And we've seen several examples of this in recent conflicts where AI and deepfakes have been used as part of information operations. So also speaking of information operations, another less discussed but also rapidly emerging threat is that of MDM. And MDM here stands for misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. So just to highlight the little bits of difference between the three terms, misinformation is refers to false, inaccurate, or incorrect information without an explicit intention to be so. Disinformation, while contextually the same, is deliberately disseminated to mislead. And malinformation may be factually correct information, which is either exaggerated or disseminated in order to cause harm to certain parties. So AI features heavily in all of these as well as cyber, and whether on the breach of the privacy side of things or on the dissemination side of things. And this discourse, as well as how it affects certain parties, has been well established in national security contexts. Given that between 2011 and 2022, 78 countries actually passed laws designed to limit the spread of MDM. But this still remains to be fleshed out in the international fora. So the hope is that as we progress further with the conversations around generative AI and cyber, this becomes a more pronounced part of those as well. And now back to your very substantive question, which I agree is very under-discussed as well. What kind of disproportionate impacts and what kind of inequities does AI sort of unintentionally produce when it is applied to cybersecurity applications as well? And I think the most pronounced of these that I can think of is perhaps gender and racial biases, which we have been speaking about in the AI space for a long time as well. And which are well established in the civilian space when we look at AI, but they remain to be observed and also discussed a little bit more in the military and the security side of things, where cybersecurity also rests at this point. So just to come up with a couple of examples so that this is a little bit clearer to those who might not be familiar. When we speak of AI biases, they can be for very, very simple products. For example, a couple of companies which brought out credit card systems had it revealed that their algorithms were giving significantly higher credit ratings to male clients despite similar or even worse credit ratings as compared to their female clients. And there was no other plausible differentiating factor apart from gender within these two paradigms. And there have been multiple studies which have also surveyed publicly available information on biased AI systems. So one of these studies was conducted by the MIT Media Lab, and it surveyed about 133 AI systems from 1988 to 2021. And it found that 44% of these actually exhibited gender biases, and 26% showed both gender and racial biases. So to put it into like a realistic context, this would show that, for example, your facial recognition systems, which are known to be biased against both gender and race, if applied to security contexts, might produce absolutely disastrous results, which might be harmful to not only particular operational environments where they're employed, but also the entity employing them themselves as they go against international humanitarian laws in multiple ways. So I think this is one of the main sort of contentions that we have when it comes to inequities produced by AI and how they're applied to cyber systems as well. And as we discuss a little bit more about how these are applied and how cyber systems exacerbate these as well, we'll see a lot more examples coming out of them. I hope not, but in the sense that we've seen them so far, it is likely to be observed in a more pronounced manner in the cyberspace as well.
That was a fantastic rundown. Thank you very much, Mona. And I know you've written a lot in this area as well, so I'd encourage anyone in the audience to take a look too, and we've worked on this together obviously before. I think it's really important to end on that line about inequities potentially fueling, in a security context, extremely negative results, and especially the kind of fixes that you might make for those kinds of solutions in a civilian space won't necessarily work in another context or won't necessarily prevent those kinds of results. So I want to give a few minutes first to Lauren and then to Kaleem, and then we're going to go to some of the questions from the Slido. So Lauren?
Thank you. Just going off a little bit what Shimona was talking about, looking at the bias and fairness of AI. AI, as she mentioned, it's trained on human data. Humans are biased. It's just kind of how it is. And it can certainly exacerbate those existing inequities and dynamics that are already here in our society and ingrained. I think a kind of a positive and a negative is that while it might exacerbate these disparities, it could also make these unconscious biases and patterns a bit more clear and assist with identifying and mitigating some of these things within our societal systems, even from a security point. Because I think a big point about AI that is often discussed, but is that the point is to always be retraining, always be, it's like a human. You want it to always be learning and evolving, and it is, but you want to point it in the right direction. And I think in the same way that we're pointing AI in the right direction, it can maybe also help us point ourselves in the right direction. And looking further into who is being disproportionately affected by this, and I mentioned this before, but AI has a really big role in cyber inequity. So this is looking at small and medium-sized enterprises that really won't get the benefits from AI the same way that larger organizations will benefit, because they are using AI to strengthen their cyber resilience. And because these small and medium organizations can face significant challenges, both due to a lack of funds and a lack of capabilities and ability to prioritize this area, the biggest issue is that these SMEs are very often a linchpin in these larger organizations' supply chain. And because of that, and also because it's important, there's a very big need for collaboration and also joint responsibility for cyber resilience and security across all of the sectors of society. And I think, like I was saying before about this collaboration, this goes beyond private organizations, but also to public and academic. But those are just a few things. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. I think those are really interesting points about biases and so on being manifested in AI systems as possibly illustrative or illuminating or a way of recognizing them. But I think a really interesting point that I want to pass over to Kaleem is because I think it ties into points he's made about, again, we have this issue of resources and scale. So the ability to take advantage of those resources or scale, and those entities, countries, other elements that can't. So Kaleem, I want to hand to you for 5 minutes, and then we're going to go to the Slido questions.
Thank you, Charles. I think more or less Shimona and Lauren already talked about it, but of course, to a certain extent, in a different dimension, Charles. Also, if we talk about the vulnerabilities and obviously, in terms of the resources and the scale of these attacks which are used, which are launched by using AI technology. So what normally we are saying, being asserted here is, for example, the fabrication or the development of a new malware into very complex form. And that's much easier. So I mean, it's quite easy to do that. Now, also another area could be is of phishing. Like, I mean, phishing is very, very complex, and these tools allowing to in a way build up the whole phishing trap is very complex, and is very difficult to in a way identify it's whether it is not true or it is true. So especially these kind of things very much they are there. Also very much for the ransomware and then the data breaches. So these are some sort of vulnerabilities per se we could see that was happening using the AI technology. And especially these are the some which I wanted to mention, and accordingly in terms of inequity, if we talk about, then surely the bigger and the smaller companies or organization, and it all depends, because the kind of infrastructure you have, the bigger infrastructure you have, the better you'll be able to have the better products, and then the better products that could drive a better protection for in order to thwart attack, or let's say in order to prevent attacks. And the same applies for the smaller companies, because since they do not have the infrastructure, and this is very much case into Africa. So I think these are the quick points, because most of the things already has been said by Shimona and Lauren. So these are the things which I wanted to add. So maybe I'll stop here.
Thank you very, very much, Kaleem. So we actually have loads of really good questions have come in already. So I'm just going to pick 3 to start with. In the interest of time, because if you're in the room at past, I think there's a coffee break, and I don't want to extend into that. I'm going to read all 3 questions first and then pass to the panel members to give their responses. So for the first one, Akeem has asked, in the age of increasingly sophisticated cyber attacks, what innovative strategies can nations implement to mitigate the risk of large-scale cyber incidents? So particularly looking at strategies that are a bit innovative or different. And the second one, we're looking at capacity development in particular. So what kind of capacities need to be developed? What type of capacity building efforts are needed to address the challenges associated with AI-enabled cyber attacks, particularly in the developing world? So I think that ties into a thread that all of our panelists have mentioned and has come up throughout, which is this issue of capacity in order to respond. And then lastly, because it touches on the points that were just raised, is from Anna, which is, can we elaborate more on gender and racial AI biases and how they are created? Where do they take biases from, and how can we make it unbiased? So I'll start with the very first part of that, because it's the easiest part, which is it comes from us, comes from society. So if the data set is based on mass human interaction, or is based on things people have done at scale, and people are biased in some way at scale, then the data set will be biased. Unbiasing it is a more difficult question. So with all 3 of those, I'm going to turn to the panel. Maybe Shimona, could I turn to you first, and then we'll do Kaleem and then Lauren?
Sure, absolutely. Very, very interesting questions, and I'm glad to know that the points were consolidated enough that there were questions on them. So I think on the question of gender and racial biases, a very solid questioning on how to unbias systems. Unfortunately, as Charlie mentioned, we know what biases the systems, but we don't quite know how to unbias them yet. However, there are always innovative answers to these, whether or not they're applicable in practical terms yet, or whether or not we've had the chance to make them applicable yet. So, of course, as Charlie said, the humans behind the systems are usually the root cause for why those systems are biased in the first place. But I'd like to bring in 2 more points here, and they would be much less human-focused. So one of those would be about the data itself that we're feeding into those systems. So there have been multiple researches around how a lot of the data that's fed into mostly civilian AI applications are very, very misrepresentative in terms of gender, just because that particular data around gender is either A, not collected, or B, not disaggregated by gender, which means that you have that data, but you don't know how many of this is male, female, non-binary, etc. So that's one of the factors that causes the biases to be even more deeply ingrained into the systems at the output stage. And then another thing that sort of tends to this as well is how that particular data, or even if you have representative data, is processed by the system. Now, when we look at AI, it relies on a process of machine learning to sort of produce outputs. And that machine learning can either be supervised by humans or unsupervised machine learning. In either of these scenarios, if it's supervised machine learning, then as Charlie said, the human's biases do get coded into the systems, or even if biases are not coded, unintended biases get oversighted. So you see those biases, but you don't correct them because when you think of them, it doesn't seem biased to you. For example, when you see mostly pictures of males as doctors, you tend to think, okay, most doctors are male and most nurses are female, when in fact that is a biased output. So that's something that you as a human annotator for that particular system will overlook because of your bias. In another scenario where the systems are unsupervised machine learning models, that obviously tends to a lot more biased systems because there's no human keeping track of how those systems are being developed. And even when the human comes into the picture at the output stage, it's very hard to sort of go back and trace back where those particular biases were coded in. At which particular point in the neural networks of that AI system were those biases coded in. So one of the things in a sort of effort to answer the unbiasing of these systems is explainable AI, which is a concept that's recently been proposed in a lot of conferences and in a lot of research as well, which sort of tends to transparentize the black box behind which all of these decisions, all of these machine learning models, all of these algorithmic decision-making processes are taking place. So what explainable AI basically does is it helps you sort of look into the system and see where the fault lies, so that you can go back to that particular process and you can then correct it in the next output stage. But of course, this is still very experimental. There's a lot of concerns about how much time it'll take, how many resources it might take, and what kind of systems do we value enough to undergo this kind of very, very reiterative forensic process. So just keeping that in mind, while we do have some inkling of what might be a solution, not all of those solutions might be practicable solutions, so to speak. So that's on the biasing, but I'd really like to also sort of tie this back into the capacity building question. And I think here when we think of technical capacity building, this is especially something that we should consider, that all of the people that are part of making these systems, that are part of annotating the data or working on the machine learning models, are sort of gender sensitized in a way that they know that these are issues. At this point, there's a lot of AI processes which happen in a gendered vacuum, just because tech fields or military fields are inherently male dominated and male oriented. So we tend to have a lot more gender oversight in these spaces as compared to maybe some other civilian systems where the male domination is not as pronounced. So I think one of the major parts of capacity building, apart from the content of the cybersecurity and AI-related capacity building, is also to have gender-sensitized capacity building in a way that you ensure that there are no lingering inequities within the humans who are part of that particular process, and also the outputs that they come up with as a result. But I'll stop here and I'll let the other panelists also weigh in.
Thank you very, very much, Shimona. I think that's an excellent set of points, especially at the end around gender-sensitive capacity building and being intersectional in that sense. Also as an advertisement, because that's part of the program that I work on. But I also want to underline the points that you're making about difficulties with explainable AI, and especially that kind of challenge around, even if you can know what the weights are for a specific system, that doesn't necessarily tell you exactly how the biases were produced. But in that, you also made these great points on the capacity front that I want to go straight to Kaleem on, because I think that ties in with some of the points you were making, Kaleem, about the kind of prerequisites that are necessary for beneficial use of AI in this space. So Kaleem, over to you.
Thank you, Charles. Maybe I can add up onto these two questions, and one is, of course, capacity building, and capacity building surely is important, and I think Shima said a lot of things onto that, but one particular thing which I wanted to focus here, and then I think Charles, that's the work done by you as the part of the Observer Research Foundation, where I saw that the UNIDIR and CIPRI, they have partnered for a new project which is funded by the European Union, and this is a 3 years project, and this 3 years project is very much talking about the raising awareness and the capacity building activities to equip the civilian AI community, particularly the next generation of AI practitioners. So I think that's something I believe that has to be taken into consideration, and this obviously will help in order to build up awareness and capacity around AI for different areas of AI which we are talking about. And also, I think there are a number of institutes and organizations which are again taking up this particular whole initiative, and one was a Future of Life Institute, and I think that you mentioned that onto your article onto that, and then they are also making some sort of, like, for example, in May 2023, a statement on AI risk hosted by the Center for AI Strategy. They're talking about mitigating the risk of extinction should be a global priority. So again, that's part of the capacity building, and this kind of work is happening. And then even OpenAI's CEO Sam Altman, I think you said that, and he's again talking about the incentivization of AI safety in his testimony to the US Senate. So I think already lots of work is happening around, and then also this is connected as a part of the capacity building into the OEWG process, where this whole capacity has to be built, and especially including AI, and this is where all member states, they have to have that kind of capacity build, and that's where awareness has to be built up by different agencies, including UNIDIR and the rest. So maybe that's one component of it. Coming back to the innovative strategy development, so for me, understanding of innovative strategy development, it starts with the kind of readiness and the maturity the country has, because it depends, because and then there are two things, in fact. It could be a national level policy or strategy onto AI, which has a clear mandate set that how the whole AI development will happen into the country, and then how the whole stakeholders and the ownerships are defined, and then what kind of resources and infrastructure that is going to be made available in order to have those innovative technologies used to develop the different sectors for a better economic development. So I think that's one. Secondly, also what is important, which I feel, is that to have a regional strategies, because even the region, they have to join hands together in order to harness the benefits of emerging technologies. So that is again, and some sort of a governance structure has to be present, and I think there are policies in America and many other countries where they have that kind of a governance structure, where they have put in order to have that policy developed, so that all the different actions which are going to take place for emerging technologies, especially AI, that is done in a way that they are AI trustworthy development, which is happening in the country. And this is where you will be able to move and balance all the sides of the whole AI technology process. So maybe I'll stop here, Charles.
That's great. Thank you very much. And thank you also very much for mentioning the program and the article that I wrote. So on that, I do want to pass to Lauren, because I know you have some points here on the innovative strategy side as well.
Thank you. So looking at the innovative strategy side for organizations and countries to combat AI threats, to be honest, the most innovative thing to do is to use these emerging technologies that are coming out, to use the AI to do the basic, boring things of cyber resilience. And an old saying that's never not going to be true is you will be breached. It will happen. It's a matter of time, which is why a focus on the resilience is so important. And the part that even large companies or organizations have issues with is legacy technology. They may have the capabilities to invest and incorporate these emerging technologies, but if you don't also lift up your legacy technologies or take them offline or decommission them as you move forward, that is your blind spot. And I think the way to be innovative is to do the legwork of as you move forward and not when something happens. And that's resilience in a short. And I just wanted to quickly say something about the gender and racial biases, which is a super interesting topic. But I think an important point to that is that data that's going into these systems, it also is a matter of access and availability to internet. There are a large portion of the world that doesn't have access to internet, or by economic class has a limited access to the internet, and this affects both awareness of how data is being used, about privacy, and also if your data is being included in these systems. But yeah, those are just a few things.
No, I think that's, thank you very much, Lauren. I think that's a particularly fantastic point to end on, is that reminder about the digital divide, and especially because that ties into points that we've been raising throughout about capacity, the resources that are necessary to take advantage of these kinds of situations and this AI technology in this space, but also the vulnerabilities that the technology itself presents in this space. So with that, I want to thank the panel very, very much. It was a fantastic conversation. I enjoyed it very much. And I think we go straight into the coffee break, unless I need to hand on to anyone else. No, with that, thank you very, very much to the panel, and we'll move on to the coffee break and then the next session. Thank you.
4 minutes. If you could I don't need. This wasn't necessary. Yeah, right. They can split it. Yeah, but they'll still like. Yeah, that's fine. So just keep that on file. Sorry, this was pretty smart of us. Wait, no. They're not young enough. So, here that I cut down on the but I realized there's way too Hello, hi, good to see you. How are you? Thank you so much for coming. Someone that you're having submitted a question already on it's lovely. Segue. Yeah. I'll wait until the time is first. I just want to push people in slowly. Did we actually send them for a no, I don't think that. We're not sure we have a full in the name. Yeah. Nothing break in the name. Yeah, no. Send people basically back home. I'm not going to be able to obviously everybody might. But I used to have dancing. I was almost counting 30 minutes past. Yeah. Oh. Okay, well, we have no one online. No. Is there? Oh, yeah?
Hi, Robbie, I'm Catherine. Nice to see you.
Is there a correct word from that part?
Oh.
Just so you know, I went according to the list.
All right.
Delegates lounge is just behind those doors.
That's where they are.
That's where they are.
I'll go and
Just put your badge on.
I don't have it. I'll Welcome back. Whoa, sorry. Welcome back. I hope you had a pleasant break and that you enjoyed the preceding session. My name is Andras Kastelic. I go by Andy. It's probably easier. And I have the pleasure of moderating this session. This session, or part 2 of session 1, will focus on the impact of technology and the new threat landscape on the implementation of the framework of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. Now, Lauren in a previous session already explained that in simple terms, but I really liked it, that AI made cyber threats faster, more sophisticated, and larger in scale. Now, understanding this impact of technology on the cyber threats, or new cyber threats, or enhanced cyber threats, is indeed important and perhaps necessary, but I think, or we think, that it's not necessarily sufficient in its own to enable collective multilateral responses of states to these new threats. As such, and building on the outcomes of the previous session, this part of the session aims to answer what are the impacts of this technology on the implementation of the framework of responsible state behavior. We'll talk in this sense, we'll talk generally about the multilateral processes and the so-called AI-enhanced ICT threats. We'll talk about AI and framework of responsible state behavior and specific elements. We'll talk about issues related to capacity building as well as the CBMs. And I am very happy to be joined by 4 excellent, smart speakers. Starting on my right is Emanuela Darqua, Senior Manager of International Cooperation Cybersecurity Authority of Ghana. Next to me is Rami Reda, Advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Egypt. On my immediate left, Alison Pitlack, Cyber Program Lead at the Stimson Center. And on my far left, Catherine Priseman, UN Office of Disarmament Affairs. Now, if you're interested in full biographies of today's speakers of this session, well, all the sessions really, they're available on a program either online or perhaps even printed if you have them. This discussion will last, moderated discussion will last for about 45 minutes, after which we have 20 minutes for Q&A. For these Q&A, we are not taking the questions from the floor, but I do invite you kindly to enter slido.com/CS2024 and submit your questions online. Some of them already came in a previous session and may be more relevant for this session. These we kept, and they're quite interesting. So I'm looking forward to perhaps bringing these to this session as well, if we certainly do have time. On that, I'd like to start with you, Alison, if you don't mind. And first is on the OEWG process and AI-enhanced ICT threats. So the mandate of the current OEWG is to continue to further develop rules, norms, and principles. We all know that, and the ways of its implementation. To what extent do you think that OEWG should, or maybe shouldn't, if you think so, consider artificial intelligence in the context of international ICT security? And how can, perhaps, if you believe that this should be the case, how can OEWG account for different developments in various AI governance initiatives that surround us outside as well as inside of the UN system? Thank you.
Thank you, and I like that we're sort of getting to the heart of the matter with this first question about, what should or should not the open-ended working group do, and just to also say, thank you very much for including me on this panel today and as part of this conference. I think it's going to be a great day and a half of conversations. I think the key phrase within the question that you've asked is to what extent, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But I thought before responding, it could be helpful for some in the room to maybe take a step back and just consider a little bit what is the state of play of the discussions on this topic within the open-ended working group. So if you look back over the last year, we've had 3 substantive OEWG sessions, and there have been definitely an increasing number of references from states and from non-governmental stakeholders about artificial intelligence in relation to cybersecurity. And in reviewing notes from the December session, for example, I'd say approximately 1/3, possibly more, delegations made such a reference. And in addition to AI, some are also noting other technologies like quantum, cloud technologies, blockchain, and IoT. And the majority of these references are being made during the group's consideration of its agenda item on new and emerging threats. And I think that the new and emerging framing is particularly important and maybe something to not lose sight of here. Of course, some are making references to AI in sort of a general or an abstract way. I think some other states have maybe been a bit more specific in describing how AI is transforming both the threat landscape by making malicious cyber activity more malicious, if you will, but at the same time also noting its potential benefits for improving cybersecurity, as we heard in the earlier panel. And then, of course, within this, there are various references and reminders that any consideration of AI in the context of the group needs to be in relation to the group's mandate and focus on ICT in the context of international peace and security. So getting back to your question, I think that this is really coming to the crux of the matter, determining what are the parameters for the group's consideration of an engagement in AI, what it means for the implementation and further evolution of the framework. And I think something I believe it was Giacomo who said this in his introduction, how can we leverage the framework also to address these threats? And it feels that right now we aren't quite at a point in the group's discussions about what that looks like concretely. We know there are expressions of concern. So maybe a good next step forward would be to have more focused discussions about specifically what is it about AI that states and stakeholders are concerned with. How can it be leveraged, how can it be utilized in our objectives to deliver cybersecurity or cyber stability, and really map out how AI correlates with or impacts different of the norms, international law, or CBMs. And I think that these focused discussions would really benefit from input from experts who work at the crossroads of these two topics, as this conference is doing over the next 2 days. The upcoming, dedicated intersessional meeting on threats could be an opportunity to go further into this. And then maybe just something else you asked about other AI governance. Yeah, so I was... I think it's important to distinguish what the OEWG's role is in relation to AI governance, not only to protect and be authentic to the OEWG's mandate, but also because there is a proliferation of processes, as we talked about in our prep call, for AI governance. Global Partners Digital put out a great report late last year mapping AI governance. I think they noted around 50 active international AI governance initiatives, and nearly a quarter of those are originating within the UN system itself. Of course, not all of these are approaching the challenges of AI in relation to cybersecurity or in relation to international peace and security, but there's definitely a point to be made about finding cohesion between and among processes when you can, and joining up efforts to ensure that there's policy coherence, but also to help reduce the resource strain that comes with needing to participate and engage meaningfully in so many different processes. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much. If you don't mind, I'll move now to the framework itself. So if that was more of a question tailored to the process. But I'm curious, Catherine, if you don't mind, do you think that a current framework of responsible state use of ICTs can accommodate the ever-evolving threat landscape? And perhaps we can start with AI, but God knows what the technologies are going to be in the next, 10 or 15 years. Will the framework still be relevant in short term and maybe even longer term?
Thanks, Andy, and good afternoon to everyone, or good evening, good morning, wherever you are online. Thanks very much to UNIDIR for the kind invitation to participate. And this is a great topic, and really Allison set the stage very well, because I think the questions that she asked and the context that she set in terms of the discussions in the OEWG are really important. And I think there's a short and a longer answer to the question that Andy just posed. Is the current framework sufficient to accommodate emerging and evolving technology? And I think the short answer is that it provides a solid basis to respond to both existing and emerging threats. So the voluntary norms of responsible state behavior, which is underpinned by applicability of international law and a commitment to capacity building and confidence building measures, do not exist in a vacuum. And when states developed these norms over the course of 20 years, a series of intergovernmental processes, they foresaw that states would have to acknowledge and take into account existing and emerging threats, including things like AI. And the norms and international law, they set out these broad commitments for states to promote a peaceful ICT environment. There's no mention of specific technology as such in the norms that we have now. And I think the idea is that they are to be responsive to this technology. We can't, I think a lot of the norms that we set at the global level, we intend them to be technology neutral precisely because the pace of negotiations don't quite coincide with the development of technology. So it's just simply not possible. But it's also, if you look at the norms themselves, things like committing to international cooperation, committing to uphold human rights. These are things that are just fundamental commitments to ensure peace and security in cyberspace. Now that's the sort of short answer. Now I'm going to slightly contradict myself to say that all of this does not preclude the possibility that states may wish to elaborate new norms that address specific advances in technology, including AI. We call the framework cumulative and evolving for a reason, because evolving to respond, but also cumulative in terms of how states engage with the norms themselves. So the OEWG itself provides a space to have interlinking discussions between what Allison spoke about in terms of identifying what the threats are, and then looking at the norms, rules, and principles about how to respond to those threats and challenges, to look at how international law applies. We know that it applies, this is reaffirmed, but how it applies and how application and interpretation of the law may be affected by technology-driven advances. And then, of course, things like capacity building and competence building to also take into account. So it provides the space to engage all that. So I think the short answer is that it's sufficient, but that it also provides the space to be responsive. So there could certainly be new norms, new proposals, things like I was just brainstorming a new norm against the use of AI-enhanced ICT targeting of critical infrastructure, which might build on the existing norm about protecting critical infrastructure. For example, if states felt that that was a gap that needed to be filled. So it's a to be continued kind of conversation. Thanks.
Very skillful contradiction to yourself. I admire that very much. But you're right. I understand the point, and I think you're very right. But I wonder how you feel about that, Rami. How do you think we can balance the potential benefits and risks of the emerging technologies in the context of the framework itself? And should the framework be explicitly updated to address specific technologies, or do you think it's sufficient enough as it is, or is it universal enough to accommodate new technologies, either AI or something else further down the line?
Thank you, Andy, and thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Catherine and Alison, for the great opening for this session. I think this is a twofold question, and I'm going to approach it this way. And to be able to approach it, I think we have to ask ourselves another question, which is, what are the basic or the fundamental characteristics of any technology, not just AI? And I think I came up with 5 main characteristics that are common in any technology. Any technology has high potential, it's uncertain, it's rapidly evolving, it's interdisciplinary in nature, and it's usually disruptive and has disruptive potential. So these technologies hold significant promise for growth, but at the same time, due to the novelty, they often come with a certain degree of uncertainty. And these characteristics highlight the dynamic nature of any new technology. I don't want to focus mainly on AI because coming back to what Catherine was saying about the different technologies and how we will adapt and evolve, I think it's important that we try to have a broader focus on characteristics of technologies more broadly. So we will see that most of them are very dynamic in nature, and they have the potential to reshape various aspects of our lives and disrupt industries and disrupt the traditional way in doing business and living our lives. So to be able to balance those potential benefits and mitigate the risks from emerging technologies, I think there are 5 main things that we have to keep in mind. First, we have to adhere, most logically, we have to adhere to the existing framework of norms that we developed over the years. And secondly, we have to conduct risk assessments and lay out mitigation strategies. Third is through transparency and public participation. Fourth is international cooperation and collaboration. Fifth is through capacity building and education. I will not delve into the 5 points, of course, but I'll focus on the first 2 because I think later in our conversation today we'll cover many of the points that I mentioned here. So first on the adherence, as I mentioned, we have a very important body of work that has developed throughout the years. Since 2010, we have had GGEs and later in the years, the OEWGs, which have produced a very important body of work that we can use and that we have to adhere to. So this is a very logical and first step for states and other stakeholders as well to be able to balance this potential benefits and risks coming out of emerging technologies. Second, I think it is very important that before deploying or adopting any new technology, states and other actors should conduct very thorough risk assessments and have litmus tests for how these technologies will affect our lives and what are the vulnerabilities associated with these technologies. And based on those assessments, states can develop mitigation strategies to address those risks, and such as implementing appropriate cybersecurity measures, establishing protection regulations, and promoting responsible development practices. By implementing those measures, states can strive to balance the potential benefits and risks of emerging technologies within the framework of responsible state behavior. And this will always require ongoing efforts and adaptation as technology continues to evolve, but it is essential that we do this work. On the second part of should the framework be explicitly updated to address technologies, or can it remain technology agnostic? We have always argued that rules, norms, and principles need to be generic and agnostic to the type of technology that could represent a threat. Almost all technologies, particularly in the domain of cyber, are of dual use. And in most cases, the point is not to prohibit the technology itself, but the malicious use that might result from this technology. So here's why I believe we need to have a technology agnostic approach, because it provides 4 major points. Future proofing and dual use nature, fostering innovation and broader adaptability. Future proofing as focusing on overarching principles rather than specific technologies allows for greater adaptability and longevity. New technologies emerge rapidly, and a framework that is based and focused on specific technologies would be outdated very quickly. And most technologies are of dual use, so they have both beneficial and potentially harmful applications. So it's the malicious intent behind the technology that we need to focus on. A technology agnostic approach encourages innovation by allowing flexibility in the development and the use of new technologies, while also establishing clear boundaries on what is inappropriate or appropriate behavior in cyberspace. And generic principles that address the underlying risks and concerns posed by technologies can be applied consistently across different domains. So this fosters a more comprehensive and unified approach to responsible state behavior in cyberspace. The challenge is, of course, how can we operationalize these principles and applying them to specific technologies and situations that emerge. So I do believe that, again, thorough risk assessments is very important in this regard. Contextual application is also another important aspect, and regular reviews and updates to the framework. And going back to what Catherine and also I think Alison touched on this point, that we need to have updated reviews and updates on the framework or any other framework that we might develop in the future.
Thank you. Such unison. I like that. Emanuela, thank you very much for your patience, and I'm sorry to be only coming to you now. But given this rapidly changing technology environment, and because of that also threats, which we talk about it today, what measures do you think states can take to implement, or rather continue implementing, the framework of responsible state behavior in the use of ICTs?
Thank you very much for the question. I think to answer to the best of my ability, the best I can do is share my view as a government and a policy person from the Cybersecurity Authority's perspective. And I think before you even talk about implementation of responsible state behavior, before you even look at how to put in place measures that will be beneficial to protection of your cyber ecosystem or strengthening and making sure that your environment is resilient, you do have to start with political commitment. You notice that in most governments, the ownership of cybersecurity can be a very difficult conversation in terms of, does it start with the Ministry of National Security? Does it go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration, Ministry of ICT? So having a dedicated political office that is able to establish the need for frameworks or the need for policies and regulation can be very useful. In our case, that mandate was given to the Ministry of Communications and Digitalization that, okay, handle all things cybersecurity related, because the current government was in a digitalization phase where they were trying to move a lot of our traditional modes of doing things to digital platforms. So then the question is, how do you do that without ensuring that cybersecurity is done concurrently? In most African countries, you look at research right now, and you are seeing research like Africa is losing, for example, $4 billion in cybercrime activities. You cannot sit back and say, okay, we'll pay attention to this in the next 10 years. You know, if you're trying to digitalize your ecosystem, you should be worried that in your efforts to generate income through digitalization, you are hearing statistics that you're actually losing more in value. So having strong political commitment can be very beneficial to ensuring that norms are adequately implemented. Then you have capacity building, ensuring that member states are actually have the skills and the tools needed to efficiently implement these norms in their local context is very beneficial. For example, if you're looking at protection of critical information, if you're looking at international cooperation, what does that mean for you at a local level? Awareness creation, capacity building. Taking Ghana, for example, we had the National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. You have so many local languages in your jurisdiction. What does that mean for us? How do we interpret these policies in a way that a small institution, for example, in the northern part of Ghana, can efficiently contribute to implementing norms at a local level? How do we efficiently ensure that even the technical teams, the CERT teams, when they come to UN engagements, what does that mean for them? Are they able to understand what is going on at an international level? Are they able to translate these policies that we discuss here back home in a way that it's useful for them? If you talk about do not damage your CI, what does that mean for us? For Ghana's case, for example, it had to start with, first of all, designating your CI, putting in place frameworks to ensure protection of your CI. So in as much as we sit here and have these beautiful conversations, when you go back home, how do we step-by-step implement that? That then brings me to having efficient legislation and policies to ensure that you're able to regulate your cybersecurity ecosystem. And I think that only happens when you have good political leadership, you have strong direction in terms of, okay, this is the end we are trying to achieve, these are the steps we are trying to take, and this is the institution that is going to help us get there. Then you build the capacity of your team, at a higher level and at the local level, domestic level, private institutions, NGOs, they can be very beneficial in these conversations. Then you ensure that you have your legislation, Cybersecurity Act, medium, long-term policy and strategy to ensure that you are regulating and implementing the existing norms within a framework of your local context. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm actually really happy that you brought in the question of non-governmental stakeholders into the implementation of the norms locally or nationally. We'll be talking about this a bit more a bit later. But I'm glad because I'll make a good segue. Catherine, I'd like to turn to norms specifically now. Are there any specific norms that you think that implementation of these norms should take into consideration today AI, in the future new technologies? Are there any that are so specific that you think, okay, this is something that AI can really, really change when it comes to the implementation of these particular norms? And if you feel like adding a bit to that, you alluded before to, or you not alluded to, you mentioned international law. If you don't mind talking about briefly about international law as well, are there any challenges that you envision on that front? That's my favorite topic, so looking forward to it.
Thank you. I like law too. I'm not a lawyer, but I still take the chance to talk about it. Yes. Again, I think the short answer is there are certain of the 11 voluntary norms that we have now that lend themselves in particular to implementation with keeping in mind new technology. For example, to list them, 13E, when we say 13E, meaning it was paragraph 13E in the report, it's a bit UNEs here, but related to human rights, upholding human rights and fundamental freedoms. I think here we would see a particular need to look at investing and advancing technical and legal measures to make sure that AI-enhanced cyber ICT tools, for example, do not impinge on human rights and fundamental freedoms. The norm related to measures to protect critical infrastructure, 13G. So taking into account the need to ensure the security of the life cycle of critical infrastructure, taking into account technical advances, and then other norms of more technical nature like integrity of the supply chain, security of ICT products, disclosure of vulnerabilities. So these particular norms, I think, sort of jump off the page as being particularly relevant to advances in technology. But all that to say, I think further to the first point about the normative framework being sort of not existing in a vacuum, I think all of the norms, and this is certainly what Rami's good point about being technology neutral and being in the implementation needing to take into account advances in technology. So while, as I just rattled off a few of the norms, I think of a particular technical vibe to them, I think the implementation of all the norms, you need to take into account this sort of chapeau of what is the technology doing in that regard. And then maybe something on international law. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question to think about. How does new and emerging technology like AI, how does that impact consideration of the applicability of international law to state use of ICTs? Now, I think the first statement, and this is said over and over and over again by states, is that they affirm the applicability of international law to cyberspace, to the use of ICTs, and that's not disputable. But what is under consideration is how it applies, right? Not if, but how. So regardless of the technology itself and related advancements, we know it applies. It's like, international humanitarian law, like those principles stand, and it's a matter of making sure that the technology itself can conform to the IHL principles, for example, to put it in a different context. But I think as states continue to unpack how international law applies and present their national positions, and we continue to encourage states to do that, I welcome, for example, that the AU just came out with a common position on international law, which is excellent. The question could be, is how is AI-enhanced ICT threats that might affect the efficiency, effectiveness, scale, scope of malicious incidents, how might that impact the applicability of law? For example, if a state interprets a cyber operation that targets critical infrastructure and results in a, quote, serious damage, injury, or death, or a threat of such an operation being a use of force, how would AI's integration into that impact that qualification of this threshold of serious damage, injury, or threat? So it's sort of it doesn't change the question, but it might change the consideration and the criteria used to look at those questions. And then more generally, other questions to consider, I think, when talking about laws, human rights concerns, as I mentioned, risks of AI algorithms violating human rights, and then also the data protection itself, of course, because data underpins so much of the AI technology. So I think it's an area we haven't really had detailed discussions on yet. So certainly something to consider. I think as a point of departure, states are still, many of them, looking at how to develop their national position on applicability of law to cyberspace. But within those positions and detailing those positions, it could be useful to have states also consider, well, how will these cutting-edge technologies, so to say, how would AI-enabled, AI-enhanced activity impact the interpretation, if at all? Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, one thing that, if I may add, but just in my personal capacity, one thing that I often battle with when it comes to international law and AI is the question of accountability. And in connection to that, obviously, international law of state responsibility. And I think that that has already happened in the private sphere. When it comes to different ChatGPTs and generative AI and the rights of the artists and so on and so forth. There's no immediate connection here to state responsibility, I know, but I think that may be problematic in the future and hopefully a matter of international discussion as well. Sorry to jump on this, but I have my thoughts. So I'd like to move now on to a next element of the framework of responsible state behavior, and that is the capacity building. So Emanuela, how can multilateral processes, be it OEWG or any future multilateral process on international ICT security, support or enable UN member states in addressing the potential implementation issues of the particular framework now with the new dawn of AI?
That's a really good question. I think the interesting thing about the OEWG and other multilateral processes when it began was, I don't know if this was similar to other member states, it's just realizing how lengthy the process was going to be. But I think with time, also realizing that the OEWG, for example, in itself ended up becoming a confidence building measure, in as much as we were discussing confidence building, capacity building among other elements. And I think the beauty of it is how well it has fostered trust, led to understanding of threats in other jurisdictions, led to understanding issues from multiple perspectives, which leads me to the point of having different perspectives in a room, having multi-stakeholder representation in a room, sharing different views, sharing different ideas. Personally, as a government representative, one thing I've observed from especially the non-government parties is how well informed in terms of data and research they bring on board, which is a very interesting perspective. It builds your level of awareness of some of the issues that are happening, because sometimes at a policy level, you are trying to see so many things at the same time, but then you have non-stakeholder institutions that, for example, have a very specific focus. So they are able to give you a very comprehensive understanding of just sort of a small dot in a wider ocean, and then imagine multiple stakeholders giving you very full information about different topics. I think it enriches the conversation. So OEWG perspectives, other multi-stakeholder perspectives, give a very holistic approach to understanding ICT threats. And in addition to, like I mentioned earlier, that it's a confidence building measure in itself. We have the proposition by Kenya, for example, for the threat repository. You have the POC directory, which is coming up. Having such concrete outcomes from these processes makes us have more tangible ways that we can address these issues. For example, we all say, yes, cyber crimes are transborders. It's beyond jurisdiction. What does that mean for us? It means we should implement measures that allow us to then work with each other if we keep saying that it's transnational in nature. So having concrete, tangible outcomes from the OEWG processes and other multilateral processes, learning from best practices, learning in the room. Some countries like Ghana are licensing and accrediting cybersecurity professionals. You have other countries that have different ways they take on capacity building exercises. How do you translate that to your local context to also not always try and reinvent the wheel if other countries are already doing it and it's working? Some countries have legislation that has been working for years. Learn from those legislation, learn from those policies, try to localize it in your national context. So it's helped in capacity building, it's helped in building trust, it's helped as a confidence building measures, and it's also helped get multiple perspectives from different resources that are always present in the room as well.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned or called on looking at your neighbor for inspiration on policies and legislation. I think this is a really good point, and I'm happy to shamelessly plug here that UNIDIR's Cyber Policy Portal and AI Policy Portal can probably provide quite a lot of insight into your neighbor's policies and legislation. Moving on, and you touched upon that topic already, but nonetheless, I want to be a bit more specific, Rami, with you on CBMs. So what role can international cooperation play in leveraging this technology for responsible state behavior in cyberspace? Can technology facilitate CBMs? We talked a lot about threats coming from these new technologies, in this particular case AI, but this is now flipping the script. Can we talk about how technology can help us?
Thank you, Andy. I think this was a pretty optimistic panel up till now, but I don't know if... I think there is, specifically on AI, if we take a look on what AI brings to the table, we'll see that there's huge potential in data analysis, in efficiency improvement, predictive analysis, and accessibility of technology in general. One of the previous speakers in the previous session mentioned that we can let AI do the tedious stuff, and it makes perfect sense. So I think this is useful as well in the context of CBMs and confidence building measures. We could enhance the threat detection and analysis using AI. We could have faster responses to cyber attacks and faster coordination. We can also facilitate communication and information sharing. Like Emanuela mentioned, you might have an incident that is happening on the cyberspace, but it's related to Africa in some parts and related to the Balkans in the other parts. So we can use AI-powered tools for real-time translation to avoid misinterpretation and other stuff that could come out of this situation. We could have also building trust and reducing misunderstanding by using the AI algorithms to help identify the biases in communication. And most importantly, we can detect misinformation and disinformation in campaigns online to reduce manipulation, which is, I know for a fact, and we all know that there's a lot of effort and resources being put into this by many companies now. Of course, this is not always optimistic. There are a lot of challenges and considerations that we have to take care of, and more particularly the bias in AI development, and we have to ensure how we can make it fair and how we can make it applicable in this regard, and also to implement the robust security measures to prevent any misuse in the AI-powered systems. And a lot of discussions are taking place in different aspects in different industries. And for example, I also touch upon nuclear facilities and how AI will affect that. So it could be very helpful in building trust, but it also could be used maliciously for other purposes.
Sorry. Thank you. Thanks. I was hoping you were going to be a bit more optimistic, but okay. Nuanced approaches seems to be the flavor of this panel, which is actually very good. Now, I do have a question. When we were preparing for this panel, we came up with this question, but it also popped in the questions from the audience. So I'm really happy that there's a certain overlap and interest in this particular topic. And this topic is the so-called human-centric approach to international cybersecurity. So we know that as threats evolve, so do harms and impact on societies as well as individuals. And a number of civil society organizations and also member states have raised or have called for so-called human-centric approach to international cybersecurity in the current multilateral discussions. Alison, what does a human-centric approach in cybersecurity mean in the context of this new, again, era of AI or any other technology-driven threats? Thank you.
Great question. And actually, so when giving a similar talk last year, I learned that human-centric means something very different to the technical community. So maybe just to get us all on the same page, because I think we might be a little bit of a mixed audience. When we're talking about human-centric in this context, or at least in my response right now, we're talking largely about being human rights respecting. And this is a concept that has gained a lot of attention and support over the last decade or so, in particular within the human rights community, but also within other multilateral and multi-stakeholder discussions. And I think it's a little bit like a human security approach. It's a way of centering the individual and the society at the center of understanding impact and harm and your rationale for action. It's a bit of a counter to the tendency that we have when talking about international security to have the national-centric, national security approach up front. And I think that we've come really a long way in the OEWG since 2019 in cementing and continuing to grow support for human-centric approaches. I can actually recall a conversation with some human rights groups when the very first OEWG session took place in 2019, and they were like, do you think anyone's going to want to talk about this, or will it be like a very securitized environment because it's coming out of the first committee? And I was like, well, possibly, but we'll see what happens. And so I think we've come a long way. There's still a long way to go for sure, but definitely I think that it has come through a lot. And of course, that's anchored through the framework itself. We already spoke about Norm E with its affirmation of two different very important Human Rights Council resolutions, as well as in the affirmation of the applicability of international law, including international human rights law. But, as to get to your question, of course, the threats are changing, and, I think we had a really wonderful presentation from Shimona and others in the earlier panel about, the harms related to artificial intelligence, what it means for gender, racial, and other bias in data, and what that can lead to, what are the practical impacts and implications of that. So, earlier today I was at the Women in Cyber Fellowship training, and we were talking a little bit there about gender and cybersecurity, and we brought up there again, how is AI transforming the nature of the cybersecurity threat in relation to gender? What does it mean when deep fakes are being used in a very gendered way? What does it mean for women's participation in democratic and other processes in public life? So this is just sort of one example of how the threats are playing out in other ways. So, taking it back full circle to the open-ended working group, and what does that mean for our work? I think it means a need to keep pace with the threat as it continues to evolve, being cognizant that yes, there are benefits definitely in AI to how we can do cybersecurity, but it is bringing new risks, many of which pose human rights concerns and which challenge human-centric approaches. I think it could be good to integrate those concerns more explicitly or more robustly into the conversations that are being had in the open-ended working groups. When we're talking about human-centric, can we expand that a little bit further? And then also, Catherine, you made the point about, Norm E and how, I think we're talking a little about how some of the norms could be more easily or maybe more adaptable to these new threats. And I think that this is, Norm E is sort of an interesting one because the two resolutions that are referenced in it, they're very foundational to this topic, but they were also passed some time ago. And they've had updated versions adopted in the Human Rights Council last year, or maybe I guess it was 2 years ago now. The Council also, passed other resolutions on new and emerging digital technologies and human rights, which had a heavy focus on military use of AI. So I think there's lots that's been happening in that space that maybe we need to be a little bit better in alignment with or more aware of as we talk about this over here. Yeah, I think I will maybe stop there. Oh, no, I actually just had one more small point, if that's okay. And this sort of just, I wasn't planning to say anything about this, but it came to mind, I think when, Rami, I think you're talking about dual use. I also feel, and this is something that we're exploring a little bit in our research right now at Stimson on accountability, is do we need to update how we talk about dual use in the context of these kinds of technologies? Because is the sort of civilian, military, peacetime, non-peacetime dichotomy, is it as immediately obvious and easy to apply and understand when we're getting into technologies where there's more of a gray zone and the human rights and human-centric implications of that? Thank you.
Thanks for that. Now, with that, we've sort of exhausted the initial framework that we set out to, oh my God, the framework is not an appropriate word here, initial plan that we set out for the beginning of this panel, or the first part of the panel. Now, with this, I'll slowly transition to the questions online. Now, mind you, one little thing that I noticed here, no one seems to be voting on the questions, so if you particularly like any questions, they're going to pop up closer to the top of my list here, so meaning that I ought to prioritize this particular question. But I'll start now in chronological order, again, given that they're all weighed the same. And this question is essentially still from the first panel. And I was wondering, Alison, still you, I'm sorry, but how can non-governmental stakeholders contribute to this better understanding of changing landscape in the multilateral processes?
Yes, I love this topic. No, I think it's I was happy to hear that the contributions of non-governmental stakeholders came up quite a lot in the panel today as well. Yeah. And Manuel, I can't remember exactly how you said it, but there's something about multiple drops, maybe, of making. I can't remember, but it was very nice. And I think really all we can really do is repeat what's been said so many times, is that cybersecurity is a shared responsibility. And in the UN, governments are the primary actors. But outside of the UN, other stakeholders are doing a lot in their day-to-day, all the time, to identify threats, to respond to threats, to raise awareness and socialize the work that we do here as well. And if threat mapping and threat analysis was already complicated before AI, I think it's only going to get more so, which means that the pool and type of expertise that you need, I think, is also only going to grow. And so, if you kind of want to think about sort of like specific contributions of different types of actors. Of course, the private sector is already day-to-day doing so much threat detection and response, including the identification and tracking of specific threat actors. Microsoft, Google, others like MITRE with the attack framework, and so on. But others in civil society are also doing their own mapping and tracing of cyber incidents that I think can be useful for the conversations that we're having here. The work of Cyber Peace Institute, the European Repository of Cyber Incidents, and others. And of course, the role of the technical community too. And I think that, yes, I think that there's multiple roles that we can play, and even sort of getting beyond the maybe very technical identification of threats and how that sort of plays into the conversations here is also the contextualizing. We're just talking about human-centric approaches and human rights. Civil society stakeholders are always on the front lines of this, so how can their experiences and their research also feed into the conversations here?
Were you reaching for a mic? Yeah. No, you don't need to. No, I was wondering. No. Okay. Okay, very well. You're going to have to, all of you, are going to have to help me in decoding some of these questions, because I'll read them as they are. Some people did start voting on them, so that's good to see. So the first question that seems to be popping up now is, considering the global geopolitical tensions that exist today, how close are states to agreeing on what constitutes appropriate behavior in cyberspace? Would anyone like to tackle that? Otherwise, I can do it as well. But Catherine, please.
Thank you for the question. Yes, I mean, regardless of the topic, I mean, geopolitical tensions, challenges to the international security landscape will impact the ability to forge consensus. In terms of what constitutes responsible state behavior in cyberspace, I mean, I think we have that in terms of the framework, right? This is the point of departure. It took over 20 years, and it continues to be discussed and unpacked. But I think those basic rules, principles in those norms, in the affirmation of the applicability of international law, gives us a picture of what constitutes responsible state behavior in cyberspace. So I think we are holding on to that because it's really important to have that baseline agreement. In terms of further evolution and unpacking of that framework, yeah, we are, subject to the environment in which we find ourselves, so things are challenging. But I think, as Emanuela was saying, the open-ended working group gives a chance to build that confidence and to build that trust, even in spite of the challenges to the international security environment. And as our Undersecretary General always says, we have to continue to make progress, not in spite of the difficult circumstances, but precisely because of the difficult circumstances. And so how close are states to maybe reaching new norms or major breakthroughs? I mean, it's hard to say. Conversations remain difficult, but a lot of progress has been made. And 20 years feels like a long time, but getting 193 states to come together to agree to something by consensus, and this framework has been agreed by consensus, takes quite a bit of patience and work. So I think you enter this work and you engage in the open-ended working group because you believe that there's a possibility for that, and you have to hang on to that. So I remain optimistic.
And thank you for your work, Catherine, in this. The next question is very interesting, and I'm not really sure if anyone can chip in on that. I certainly am no expert on that, but I'd love to hear. So Anonymous asks, what consideration is being given to the use of AI for international cyber keeping directed by Security Council? So I guess the question relates to the link between the AI international cyber peacekeeping in the context of Security Council. Any thoughts on that? Otherwise, we can also move on if this is not the case. Anyone, any specialists on Security Council and peacekeeping?
I'm not an expert on the Security Council, but just to say that we have recently been doing a little bit of research looking at how the Security Council has traditionally looked at ICT and cyber issues, what might be some potential ways to better integrate the issue within its existing working methods. And I think that it's been an interesting it's an interesting study because it's also, you know, a General Assembly issue, and I know that there are some turf feelings about that within amongst member states, understandably. But there are other issues that have sort of been handled by both bodies in different ways, and it's sort of figuring out how one does it in a way that's different than the other. And I think that one of the things that we're looking at is how AI is sort of being addressed in the Council. And I don't have a definitive answer yet, but it is something that we're looking at, and what might be the implications for how cyber can potentially be better addressed too.
Okay. The next question is also, did you? No. Oh, no. The next question is very interesting, I think. How does the international community establish a responsible cyber framework when many of the threats in the cyber realm are non-state actors? Essentially, probably, if I may paraphrase, as far as I understand, is how does the responsible framework for responsible state behavior deal with non-state actors? We've seen the proliferation of non-state actors, malicious non-state actors, I may say, in the ICT domain. And we heard today from one of the speakers on the previous panel, I apologize, I don't know who said that, but that AI has made cyber threats more approachable to certain people. And as far as I know, they're called script kiddies, and they can write malicious script with the help of AI, and indeed they have proliferated to an extent already. How does the framework fit in that when cyber threats are enhanced by AI and perpetrated fairly oftenly by non-state actors? Thank you.
Those are very good questions and very complicated ones, so I'm going to try to chip on this one. It's a very fair question to ask, but I think what we have seen in the past years in the OAWG conversations and discussions is usually that we were happy to see that corporations, I don't want to name names, are taking very similar positions, like in our case, like Egypt's positions, and calling on the governments to put regulations that actually would help them manage the infrastructure and manage the space, the cyberspace, more efficiently. And this goes back to your question on it. Definitely will not have 100% bulletproof cyberspace where only states will be able to implement the norms. But the second most important actor in this domain are other corporations and non-state actors. And I can see that we are all agreeing on the fact that we need norms and we need to implement them. And states have a primary and special responsibility in this regard. And if we have corporations on board, I think then we have a very few minor actors who would be willing and active in engaging in malicious activities.
So another call for multi-stakeholder approach. Yeah, well noted. Well noted. And I think to an extent, again, if I may, to an extent, the framework is already trying to address also the involvement or a threat coming from non-state actors and trying to, but it is a framework of responsible state behavior, right? So I think it does put the emphasis on state behavior, and then perhaps even encourages them to try to regulate the behavior of non-state actors on their particular territory. Think of Norm C, for example. That's just one of the examples. Okay, thank you for this question. That has been now addressed. I had a question here on cooperation, and perhaps if you don't mind, how do resource constraints impact the implementation of the framework, and how can this be tackled, for example, through cooperation? So essentially, the question of resource constraints and the implementation of framework, but I invite you to look through this through AI glasses, if possible.
That's actually a very interesting question, because I think it's a question we're going to be answering for a lot of years to come. I don't know if I have the answer to that, because that is something that I think most states are dealing with right now in terms of how do you, currently you have the ad hoc committee going on, you have the OAWG going on, you have the GDC process which is about to I think it's ongoing. It's supposed to conclude, and I'm not involved in that. You have IT processes. You have a lot of multiple processes that seem to complement each other and take equal priority. So discussing the issue of budget constraint can be a very difficult topic for most governments who do not have room in their ecosystem to sort of take on additional responsibilities. However, I think it all starts from, again, what are your priorities now as a state? If you get to a space where you are now ready for cybersecurity, perhaps the conversations would have been way advanced, and probably the effects that it would have had on your national ecosystem, you might spend more money trying to recover from those engagements. So when you're looking at international cooperation, it's not something that I think can happen separately from all the kind of initiatives and efforts you are trying to undertake. For example, now you have the conversations of cyber diplomacy. Other countries have been able to build capacity in that area. They've been following conversations for a long time. So how do African governments, how do countries in the global south now build their capacity to keep up with these kind of conversations? You cannot start implementing, for example, cybersecurity legislation and policy out of the blue, if I should say in quotes, without understanding how it fits in the international context. So prioritizing the need for these conversations, seeing it as the forefront of the work you are doing in light of all the other initiatives you're undertaking, perhaps might make it possible to redirect some of those resources. And then also putting in place measures to add cybersecurity to your internal government budget. For most governments, for example, perhaps cybersecurity is an afterthought, and most of the budget might go more into national digitalization efforts. But then looking at both efforts as things that have to move together, they have to move concurrently. You have to ensure that you are able to make provisions for both, and you have to make sure that you strengthen your international cooperation capacity to ensure that the legislation you're implementing locally is in line with international best practices.
Thank you, Manuel. I see that you're very proficient in questions on capacity building, and there's another question on capacity building, if you don't mind, if I may. With threat actors exploiting cyber and AI for malicious activities, what recommendations do you have for improving digital literacy and threat awareness in society? And I'll flip this question to make it more relevant for our discussion on the norms implementation, right? So, how do you think we can, or what is needed perhaps, in capacity building at a very rudimental level, so almost starting with individuals, in order to successfully continue implementing the norm, even with the maturing of the societies, for example. So how can we, you talked already top to bottom approaches, top-down approach on implementing the norms, but now I'm curious more from the bottom up, and what is needed in terms of capacity building in this case.
In terms of capacity building, I think there are actually 3 levels. Again, sharing Ghana's perspective and how we looked at capacity building to ensure that we sort of had a 360 approach to how we handle some of these issues. The top-down approach I've already mentioned. The second one was the bottom-up approach. I mentioned that slightly in one of my earlier interventions in terms of how do you engage people at the local level. We had the National Cybersecurity Awareness Month campaigns, for example, where we went to schools, businesses, government officials, local radios, and even what we realized, funny enough, when you are handling some of these conversations, is that in as much as we are trying to build the capacity of, for example, students, you realize that they are contributing more to being perpetrators than actually preventing some of these engagements, which was a huge shock for us. So building capacity at a level where you do not disregard any community in terms of their ability to contribute efficiently to some of the initiatives and policies you're trying to implement, that became a very important component of our engagement. And for example, now we have a fun way to look at capacity building in terms of an engagement we do call the National Challenge, where we challenge the students to learn some of these things and actually equip themselves and not realize that cybersecurity is only being done by governments sitting in a room and then drafting documents. But then at your level, how can you ensure that, for example, you don't click on links that would make you susceptible to cyber crimes? How do you ensure that you don't share images? Do you even know that sharing of these images are an issue in the first place? So creating awareness among the users of ICT was very important. And then the last one will be building capacity of us as well as policy holders to ensure that we are also utilizing all the tools and the resources available to us to ensure that we regulate our environment in a way where it takes all perspectives into consideration. So when I talk about policymakers, for example, not just us as the Ministry of Communication and Digitalization or the Cybersecurity Authority, but for example, we had to establish a National Cybersecurity Technical Working Group and a National Cybersecurity Inter-Ministerial Council made up of people from the Foreign Ministry, the National Security, Defense Intelligence, because when you are looking at cybersecurity, there are certain conversations, for example, that the Cybersecurity Authority is not going to be present in, but you have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs present in. So how do you ensure that all the relevant sectors build their capacity in a way that we are all working together to contribute to some of these engagements? So I think capacity building, political level, top-down, bottom-up, and also, I guess, maybe laterally among ourselves is also very useful.
Thank you. No more capacity-related questions, I promise. There are 3 questions that I'll need your help once again because I'm not so sure I fully understand. But you touched upon this topic already, and please do feel free to add if you have anything else. Others contribute as well. How can AI be positively used in the effective implementation of the framework? We've, to an extent, tried to address this already, haven't we? But please do feel free to add if you have anything else. And I welcome suggestions from the whole panel. If you have any suggestions how to perhaps implement the framework through the use of AI, that would be welcome.
Thank you, Andy, for the question. I do believe we touched upon this, and one of the initiatives, or there have been several notable attempts to address how we can maintain the relevance of the framework and use new technologies in this regard to keep it in relevance to the developments. And I think one of the very important initiatives is the POA and future mechanism. And I do believe that the future mechanism, which was, it's some sort of, I can see some laughing faces because this is a promotion for the POA, which Egypt and France and others have been part of. But honestly, I do believe that this is very relevant to this conversation because it was designed to embrace technologies, new technologies, and AI included in adapting and being able to evolve and leveraging those technologies and keeping the relevance of the framework. So as we discussed before, there is a lot that we can take out of AI: the data analytics, the learning, a lot of efficiency improvement, a lot of stuff that we can use to make sure that we are actually leveraging AI in this regard. And I think one tool to use, or one candidate tool, let's say, is the future mechanism that could be helpful in this regard.
Anyone else? We have literally 1 minute. And then I think people are keen to conclude for the evening. Anyone else? No? I have one idea. I'll keep you now here for another 10 minutes. No, I promise I'll be quick. But one thing that could be done, there's a proliferation of different policies and legislation by a number of states, especially in the emerging fields such as before it was cyber, now it's AI. I think perhaps we could use the digital technologies to help analyze some of the good practices, right? What worked, what didn't work, and then based on that, try to investigate not only perhaps what worked and what didn't work, but in the area of law, that could be also trying to establish what is the developing customer international law, for example. So what do the states consider as law in the new domain, right? So that's something that perhaps could be done as well. With that, if there are any other questions from the panel, I will give now apparently the floor to Giacomo Persi Paoli to conclude this day. I'm deeply grateful for all the conversations that we had. I enjoyed that very much, and I thank you very much for attending. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy, and thank you to all the panelists for this great discussion, great way of ending the day. I'm not even going to try in 3 minutes to summarize the last 2 hours of discussion because it would be impossible. But there are I think some key points that really remain kind of stuck in my mind. One is the fact that as we were progressing, so we started with AI and we discussed and analyzed the different applications, the different ways in which AI can make cyber threats more more pervasive, more diffused, lowering the barrier to entry for a wide range of actors, etc. So we've really seen the technological impact that AI will have on cyber. But then as we were progressing from that discussion more towards what does it actually mean for the framework of responsible state behavior, we saw that it was becoming increasingly difficult to kind of talk about technology in isolation from actors, from types of activities and malicious activities. So I think this sets us up very, very well for what is going to happen tomorrow. So I think I'm going to be using the next 100 seconds, not so much trying to look at what we've discussed today, but try to convince you of why you should come back tomorrow. First and foremost, because it's going to be a very rich day where we're going to be focusing on the other 2 critical elements that we've discussed earlier this afternoon. One is really doing a deeper dive on 2 of the most commonly, at least in the context of the OWG, 2 of the most commonly referred to types of malicious cyber acts, ransomware and supply chain security attacks. So we really want to discuss in depth, like we did today, what are these attacks? What do they actually mean? Just to make sure that everyone has the same level of understanding. And then again, looking at how do they challenge the implementation of the framework, or how can the framework be used to mitigate this type of attacks? And then in the afternoon, we're going to be tackling the last issue, which is being consistently coming through all of the discussions today, which is about actors. And again, there was a question today that I should actually have kept for tomorrow, but the framework was designed by states, for states, but many of the threats that we're discussing are coming from non-state actors. So what is the relationship there, and what can we learn? And of course, today we'll start with 3 great high-level remarks, not only by our own director, Geiss, that you've met earlier today, but also the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs will join us tomorrow morning, Mrs. Zumi Nakamitsu, and Ambassador Gafour, who is the chair of the OWG. So we're really looking forward to welcoming them tomorrow at 10. The agenda is going to be very compressed, so I do invite you at 10 to be here in the room, and because we're going to be starting right on time. And with that, I wish you a great evening and hope to see you back tomorrow in the room. Thank you.
No, if we talk about